The associate professor of history here at NKU in African American Studies, and I want to also add that he is on the advisory board as an editor, advisory board on the magazine, and has been a great help to me personally in putting out this nonprofit magazine, and you know how nonprofit people can be. Every time I mail one to a new subscriber in the post office, I say, now don't forget, this is a nonprofit group, and they tell me, oh yes, we are too. Without further levity, I would like to present someone in the room, Dr. Jackson.
And so this presentation is a discussion and a talk. So this talk is partly inspired by the construction of this book right here. It's not a carbon copy of it, so this book just came out. It's called Cincinnati's Underground Railroad. And so it's talk, and I stress talk, not lecture. Talk. It's not a lecture. So if you're thinking about that I'm going to stand up here for an hour or whatever it is and lecture to you, it's not going to happen. This is a talk. All right? So, let's talk about some of these issues here. When you talk about the Underground Railroad, at least in my opinion, what you have to keep in mind is three major concepts that African Americans have to deal with during the Underground Railroad's history. And when I say Underground Railroad, I define it as a number of prominent historian has here recently. It was the first multi-ethnic, multi-racial, human rights, civil rights movement in the history of the United States. Because African Americans and progressive whites are working together to really make the United States clearly based on the Declaration of Independence, when Thomas Jefferson writes those eloquent words, all men are created equal, endowed with certain rights, among those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So those folks who are involved in the Underground Railroad are trying to make that true. But for African Americans who are involved in the Underground Railroad, they have to deal with these three concepts consistently throughout the colonial period, throughout the American Revolution, throughout the antebellum period. They have to deal with what's called contradictions. Contradictions meaning the law saying one thing and the reality being something else. So they have to deal with that contradiction. They also have to struggle. Their life is about struggle. It's just what it is. They have to struggle with maintaining their family structure. They have to struggle with defining and redefining this concept of freedom that people throw around even today. That the concept of freedom means different things to different people at different times. Not just in the United States, but globally. But most importantly, they have to persevere. And that perseverance comes from a lot of different directions. Perhaps the most powerful direction it comes from, especially for African Americans, is from their faith. They believe in God. They believe that if things are going to change spiritually. That's one of the reasons they identify the Ohio River as the River Jordan. They have to cross the Ohio River because in their minds, that River Jordan means change spiritually. And that's the only thing they have most times, their faith. They have to hold on to that faith to persevere consistently. And so, progressive whites who are involved in the movement also have a type of faith that's going to change the landscape, if that makes sense. So the key here to understanding this Underground Railroad, number one, is the first multiracial, multi-ethnic, human rights, civil rights movement in the history of the United States, way before the civil rights movement that starts in the 1940s. Not to denigrate that movement, but this movement of the Underground Railroad comes first. It sets the landscape. And number two, these contradictions, struggle, and perseverance is the key to understanding the Underground Railroad. In this area, especially across the river in Cincinnati, the Queen City, there's a huge contradiction that deals with the emergence of the Queen City and the surrounding community and the development of the community based on these continuously patterns of urban upheavals, of urban unrest. And African Americans who live in Cincinnati, a good number of these folks who come there during the antebellum period, meaning the 1800s, pre-Civil War, have to deal with that contradiction, struggle, and perseverance consistently because of these urban upheavals and those contradictions. I'll give you one quick example. It's kind of foreshadowing what we're going to talk about today. The state of Ohio becomes clearly a place for folks to migrate to when it's created in 1803. And next year in 1804, they passed what are called black codes or black laws. And one of the key components of these black laws in Ohio is if you're an African American and you migrate to the state of Ohio, you must pay a security deposit of $500 to migrate to the state of Ohio. Mind you, Ohio is a free state. But if you come there, the law says, based on the black codes, you got to pay a security deposit of $500, and the language specifically says to make sure that you have a job or to ensure, quote, good conduct, whatever that means. And so the point here being is, even in a free state, African Americans are harassed. African Americans have to deal with that contradiction. They're in a free state, but they're not free. They're in a free territory, but they are not really free. Yes?
You said it was a talk, so.
I'm
What's the equivalent of $500 in today's money? And it was the deposit, so could they get that back if they worked it out?
No. I don't know what the equivalent is, but if you're paying it, you're not getting it back. So I would surmise, like it is today, because I don't have $500 in my pocket, I'm assuming it's a pretty good amount of money, because I don't generally walk around with $500. Some of you might, but it's not me. Even on my salary, I'm not walking around with $500 in cash. But it's a good chunk of change for folks to deal with. Of any race, mind you, even particularly African Americans. So the point here is that contradiction piece is alive and well, even in a free state. Questions so far?
How long did that last?
Until after Civil War, 1920s, I think the Constitution of Ohio is reconstructed and reevaluated in 1940s, maybe. Some people argue that the legacy even lasted until 1950. Legally, I think the 1940s. It's not enforced in the 1940s, obviously, but it's still on the books. It's still on the books. So it's not enforced in the 1940s. So it lasted a good period of time. And so just to get folks into this mindset of the enslavement period, you have to deal with some historical context here, and I try to be brief about this stuff. For example, one of the first European countries that were involved in the Atlantic slave trade was the Portuguese in 1442. First African Americans or African people who end up in what becomes the United States of America occurs in 1619 in Jamestown, Virginia. The key point here of this particular example is they come as indentured servants. They're not enslaved folks of color. They're indentured servants, which means something different than we would think. Indentured servants mean they sign a document stating that they will work for somebody for a number of years and then they will receive their freedom. And so they're treated in some ways just like white indentured servants. That kind of changes in 1640 with what's called the John Punch case in Virginia, where 3 folks run away. There's an African, there's a Scottish person, and an English person. They all run away because they're treated real bad, actually. And they're all caught. John Punch sentenced, compared to the other folks, is he is sentenced to lifelong indentured service. That's redefined as slavery. That's in 1640 in Virginia. And so this kind of demarcation point from a court system perspective starts to be defined on race based on that court decision in 1640, the John Punch case. If we're talking locally, 1788, Cincinnati is founded, situated between Ohio River from the border state of Kentucky, which allows slavery, although slavery was not permitted in the Civil War before. African Americans start to migrate to Cincinnati because, quote, it's in a free state, in a free area. But again, they're not technically free because they're still being harassed. State of Kentucky is created in 1792. Yeah, I'm going fast, I'm sorry. I've got to get to the NFL under it. So that's why I'm shooting through these other topics. I'm sorry. So if you have questions, just raise your hand. I talk. It's another map of Kentucky, typographical map. I'm sorry. So we're talking about the black codes again. 1 year after Ohio becomes a state, legislation to adopt black codes to set laws aimed at stemming the flow of free blacks into the new state. The law forced blacks who entered the state to pay $500 bond guaranteeing, quote, good behavior. I'm sorry, not good conduct, good behavior. Again, what does that mean? I'm not really sure. And so the state of Ohio is a free state, but not necessarily for African Americans. But like I talked about earlier, what helps African Americans to persevere is their faith, their Christian faith. They always believe in one God, defining themselves as everybody else, regardless of what the power structure says. And they use this consistently. They use it even into, and this is a different talk that I would give. That's one of the reasons it comes up during the Civil Rights Movement in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, especially by people like Dr. King and folks who followed that Christian faith walk, is that if the United States professes to be a Judeo-Christian society, why are some people treated differently? And so that contradiction even continues into the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. But it surfaces back here in the antebellum. Actually, it surfaces even in the colonial period in the perspective of African Americans. But in Cincinnati in particular, the first African American church in Cincinnati at the corner of 6th and Calvert Street is organized by Pastor William Allen, and was early stationed on the Underground Railroad. And again, the Underground Railroad, and this gets to some of my research, as folks know, it was a secret functioning operation. So it's not like people walking around with big old signs saying, this is a safe house, come here. Or they don't have big old maps that says, come to this direction. Most times the Underground Railroad functioned as a regional system, not a national system. It's a regional system. But it's a secret. It's, by definition, a secret functioning system. So trying to do research on the Underground Railroad, a lot of times is hard to get a hold of because the documentation is hard to find. Unless you stumble across certain things or use certain research, non-traditional research methodologies, you usually don't discover Underground Railroad patterns, routes, safe houses, etc. Because this is a non-traditional functioning system. Not like some of my some of my students in my class, of course not, when I used a multiple choice question that says, was the Underground Railroad a real railroad? And they choose true. Not a real railroad. No, that wasn't you. Just because I'm looking over there, it's not you. But one of the reasons it gets associated with the railroad system because it starts to function when the railroad system in the United States was being formed. And so it becomes synonymous with the railroad. That's why you have conductors and engineers and that kind of stuff. The names become synonymous with the system. But it's not a real railroad. Make that clear. That when you didn't pick that answer. Pick option B. Option A. Yes?
Yeah, assuming they didn't come out of Africa with a Christian kind of background, how and when were they evangelized?
During the colonial period, if you're talking South Carolina in particular, because in the colonial period, that is one of the early colonies where Africans migrated to in huge numbers that had double the population of whites and sometimes triples, if not 4 times. And once they became part of that system, they were introduced to this Christianity that whites had. And what African Americans did was to use that Christianity and link it to their African culture. If no other reason, they would read the scriptures or be taught how to read and reinterpret the Bible in their best interest and make arguments that the scriptures is a liberation device as opposed to some folks justifying Christianity. I mean, I've had that discussion where folks justify Christianity by saying in the Bible that it mentions and justifies enslavement because it's mentioned in the Bible. Or they even move to the point of talking about the story of Noah and Canaan and people looking upon his nakedness, and they were cursed with blackness. And that means an entire race was cursed to be a darker skin, and they had to be enslaved because, I mean, people interpret the scriptures how the way they want to interpret, but for African Americans, they defined it as a liberation tool. But they were introduced to this new brand of Christianity by those folks in the colonies. That's the question. Can somebody time you for me, because I try to talk a lot sometimes? And so Allen Temple, African Methodist Episcopal Church, in 1824, still thrives there today. It's not in the same location in Cincinnati, but the church is still there, and the church is still affiliated with the Underground Railroad, but it's not in the same area. So again, religion, physical churches become synonymous with the Underground Railroad during the antebellum period. And again, antebellum period, 1800s, pre-Civil War. Does that make sense? You guys got to talk. Because then I think you're not getting stuff because you're too quiet. And I have to walk around and call them games. I don't teach that purpose. So, in 1829, like I mentioned earlier, African Americans are in that free state, in that free city of Cincinnati, but by 1829, they have to deal with huge contradictions. For example, in 1829, the riot starts by whites targeting Cincinnati black citizens, convincing thousands of blacks to leave the city and go to Canada, where they found Wilberforce Colony, which is interesting because Wilberforce comes from who? Anybody heard of Wilberforce? Well, what was he known for? He's known for 2 things, not more than 2, but 2 primary things. Abolition, and what else? What's his faith? He's a Christian. So there's 2 things that African Americans link to, and they specifically, there's a whole history of Wilberforce Colony. And there's a reason why they chose that name, but that's different. But the point is, the name Wilberforce means something. It's not just this arbitrary name that they chose for that colony name. But the point here is they found Wilberforce Colony in the riots, and its fugitives were a national topic of discussion throughout the nation. And at the first Negro Convention in 1830 in Philadelphia, African Americans were talking about how do you deal with this kind of stuff, especially in a quote free state. What's also important is a couple of years later, this term, I can't remember if it's in this slide, I'm sorry, I'm not. A couple of years later, in 1831, the term Underground Railroad starts to surface. And one of the rumored stories is it surfaced because in this area, an enslaved African American escapes named Tice Davis, escapes from Kentucky and comes over to Ohio. And his owner, talking to another person, says, this guy must have escaped, and he used the terms of the time, I'll clean up his language, of course. He must escape using some type of underground road. And so the term starts to stick after 1831. But that's just one interpretation. And that's one of the reasons why I love history, and one of the reasons why I teach history, is it's about interpretations. It's about what you can prove with the evidence. I've never stood up in my class to say this is the truth per se. What I have said is this is my interpretation. I can prove it with these factual materials that are evidence historically. And so for African Americans, they have to deal with that historical evidence because they lived that stuff. and again, this is one example. They lived this riot in Cincinnati in 1829. They lived like Tice Davis, that Underground Railroad. That's what they did. Another example of a contradiction. 1841, one of the worst riots in American history breaks out in Cincinnati when white dock workers, mostly Irish, which is another story in itself, attacked African Americans believing that they are taking their jobs. 56 people died, more than 200 are injured. For the first time, black communities chooses a leader to organize the defense of their homes. In the end, blacks are arrested, pinned in like animals. This is the best part of this. Pinned in like animals on 6th Street Broadway and then thrown in jail. City officials, and I quote, later released blacks and say they were imprisoned them in order to protect them from rioters. That's the best part of this piece. It's just a great understanding of the system of law and culture at the time. We did it to protect you. That's what we did. At least that's what we believe. And again, this is a long history of these upheavals in the city of Cincinnati. And so for African Americans throughout the antebellum period, they have to deal with contradiction, struggle, and perseverance. And one way to persevere is to organize themselves, organize their community, leading the charge in the abolition movement that's different than anti-slavery. At least my argument on it. Anti-slavery meaning folks argue, maybe, kind of, sort of, that enslavement's wrong and we're going to end it sometime down the road. Because you can't just take a workforce away from folks because you destroy their economy. I'm paraphrasing arguments. They're anti-slavery folks. Abolition is a whole different ballgame. It's based on 4 principles. Number 1, slavery should end immediately, like today. Not tomorrow, not next year, today. Number 2, the abolition movement is was a interracial movement. Progressive whites and African Americans working to change. Number 3, most abolitionists did not believe in violence against slavery. They believed like this concept of what's called moral suasion, using the words of the time. You use moral arguments to persuade folks. They also didn't believe, number 4, in what's called colonization. That you free enslaved person of color and you have to colonize them outside the United States. And mind you, even Lincoln himself, that's a different lecture, I have a whole lecture on Lincoln, but even Lincoln himself, at one point, believed in colonization. That he believed that slavery was morally wrong, but you had to get them outside the United States once you freed them. But I give Lincoln credit. Lincoln changed. Why he changed is a whole different discussion, but Lincoln changed. Lincoln made the argument during the Civil War that slavery had to be part of the war. It had to be part of the war. And as one of my colleagues, we talked about this before I had this discussion. This gets you into this huge discussion of the emancipation itself of Lincoln. Because technically the emancipation issued by Lincoln in January of 1863 didn't free African Americans per se. Because it freed enslaved folks of color in states that had left the Union. What does that mean? That means what moral or legal authority did Lincoln have over states that had left the Union? Legally. Did he have any authority? Probably not, because they left the Union. But for African Americans themselves, they interpreted the emancipation in a way that they were free. In their minds, in their movements, in their activities, they're free. Because that's what they believed. But prior to that point, you have all these other movements, the American Colonization Study in 1817, Liberia, Paul Coffey, which is kind of a nationalist, the failure of colonization movement, David Walker's appeal, and David Walker's kind of a nationalist and radical, William Lloyd Garrison, Nat Turner obviously is kind of a radical, not kind of, he is. And so the point here is you had all these underpinnings during this period of the Underground Railroad pushing folks to do things to end slavery. So to understand the Underground Railroad, you can't take it out of this historical context that there's other things going on. You can't isolate it out of the American Colonization Society. You can't isolate it out of people like Paul Cuffey. You can't isolate and pull it out of the context of a David Walker or William Lloyd Garrison in that term, because it's all revolving at the same time. Does that make sense? Yes? No? Yeah, I'll make them say it for myself.
Yes.
You're talking to your students now?
Yes.
You're talking to your students now?
Now I'm talking to my students and myself. Oh, it's anybody heard of any tensions that occurred in 1850 in the United States? Anybody? Any other stuff? You make any reference to the Fugitive Slave Act? Anybody? It's like I'm teaching a class, really. Like zero participation. Mark Garner, anybody know that case? Anybody?
Yep, 11.
Good. So, what do you know about it? Mark Garner.
She was from the Richwood area in northern Kentucky. She had several children. She decided she didn't remain in slavery anymore. She and her husband and children. They did attempt to escape across the Ohio River during a cold winter. She made it as far as the Ohio. Slave catchers came quickly across the Ohio and downtown Cincinnati, and on her trail, and she knew that they were coming. She quickly attempted to kill her children. She succeeded in killing one of them, severely injured the other ones, and her case is controversial simply because Ohio said, wait a minute, she's a person. We must put her into the court system and prosecute her as a human being because she committed a crime. Kentucky, on the other hand, took the stance that no, she's not a person, she's property, therefore she can't go through the court system. And a legal debate ensued between the state of Ohio and Kentucky as to what to do with Margaret Garner. And that five little line ad similar to the one there is what Toni Morrison read and saw was inspired to write the novel Beloved based upon the Margaret Garner story. That's what I know about Margaret Garner.
When History Day first started, we had a bus trip, and we went down to Richwood and toured the church, and they showed us the book where Margaret Garner was baptized, the graveyard, or supposedly where the children were buried by the fence, and then they had a speaker presentation about this story.
Two other kind of points of the Margaret Garner case. Number one is a turning point in the legal structure of what is going on towards defining the status of enslaved African Americans. Because the case clearly focuses on what? Are they property or are they human beings? That entire case turns on that. Because before that case, the 3/5 clause, when the Constitutional Convention occurs, defines African Americans who are enslaved as 3/5 of a person. Dred Scott in 1857 says that African Americans are not citizens of the United States, and thus the Constitution does not apply to them. So the question becomes, prior to Dred Scott, how do you define the role of free blacks? Also, how do you define the status of enslaved African Americans? This turns everything, this entire case. Because if the United States is supposedly based on laws, what are we doing? Is she a person or not? But it's necessary. It's necessary because as I started this talk, if we believe that all men are created equal and endowed with certain rights among her life and liberty and life, liberty, and a pursuit of happiness, what are we doing in antebellum era? What are we doing as a country? I love these turning point moments in American history because it forces the country to look inwards and ask itself, what are we doing as a nation? What are we doing? And it takes people with courage and persistence and perseverance to make a country deal with this stuff. And it may even cost them their lives. Or as I say at another lecture about the Underground Railroad, what the Underground Railroad also teaches us very clearly in my mind is this. Ordinary people can do extraordinary things all the time if they choose to do it. Because almost none of these folks who were a part of the Underground Railroad were famous. They were not. They were just ordinary people doing extraordinary things because they chose to do it. They're not big names. They didn't come from big families. They didn't come from money. They're just ordinary people doing extraordinary things because they chose to do it. There's always a turning point. You make a choice. And it may cost you. It may cost you your friends, your family, your friends, your inheritance. It may cost you. But you know exactly when those turning moments come. You know it because you feel it in your soul. You feel it shaking. You can't tell me that Margaret Garden didn't feel that shaking moment. Every decision she made after she ran away, she felt it in her soul, in her bones. And the nation itself feels that stuff the closer it marches to the Civil War. It feels it. Questions? Now I'm talking. I'm done for the lecture.
How historically accurate do you think the movie is to this actual?
How historically accurate do I think the movie that was inspired by Margaret Garner's case and became the film Beloved, how historically accurate was it? Broad strokes is accurate. The imagery is a whole different issue. Imagery meaning a lot of the film is kind of what was dreamed and how Toni Morrison writes and what she does in her writing because she tries to push the envelope. And it was a Hollywood production. Hollywood production does what it does.
She's clearly states, though, from the very beginning of writing the novel that this is simply an inspiration from the story that I've learned. And she tells you from the very beginning, I've done some research on this, that, you know, what she's put out is supposed to be fiction, but she's based it upon a story that should be, you know, of Margaret Garner, that is a story significant enough to tell that we really need to have awareness about.
Absolutely.
And it really reveals that struggle that she had to deal with, that conflict within herself, that contradiction. I'm a mother, but I'm a murderer.
Yep.
And so I think Morrison, in her fictional piece, I think draws people in through the fantasy, but then reveals the history through the reality.
Absolutely. Yes?
Was there any conclusion between Kentucky and Ohio about what it was? Since Ohio recognized fugitive slave laws and that. So did they ever come to a point that said yes or no is the person or property?
Nope. The other part of this case is important is, and you raised a good point, is her defense counsel. Anybody know who defended Margaret Garner?
Chase.
It was Chase.
Sound to be changed.
Is he important?
If something goes on,
Building next
He's kind of
door.
famous, kind of sort of thing. You sure? They about to go make too many arrests.
He's part of Lincoln's cabinet.
Exactly.
Dr. Jackson,
Yes.
how much do you think the laws that existed then, particularly as it related to the view of blacks and what they're being human or not human, still affects us, particularly in our voting rights today? And why do we need to have a Voting Rights Act renewed every 25 years?
I think as a historian, there's no way to get past that, at least in my opinion. current issues should not be analyzed in vacuums, because there's always a historical component. And so, Voting Rights Act 65, it has a historical component that has to be recognized. So it has to be revisited over and over and over and over. It just has to. There is no point, but that's just my biased opinion. I can tell you I'm biased, because I'm a historian. Things just don't fall out of the sky without a historical component. And so you've got to analyze things from a historical perspective and revisit these things over and over and over. And one of the questions folks always ask me, if not in public, but in private, when are we going to get past these types of issues? Well, I don't know. Because when you have a country that was built on certain constructions, be it race, gender, class, or whatever it is, for hundreds and hundreds of years, going in one direction, it's not just going to magically shift. Let's just say it started to shift in the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s, which means how many years? 50s and 60s to 2014 is how many years? It's like swimming downstream. You swim downstream for miles and miles and miles and miles, then you all of a sudden decide to turn around, and then you pretend that you're in the same spot. You're not in the same spot at all. You got to swim upstream. And it's going to take the same amount of time, if not more, and power to swim upstream. So you're going to continue to visit all these issues. For me, it's about education, historically. Learning history, folks. This stuff is not new.
I'm going to make a point and talk that follows this one that I think will shock a lot of people, and that is when the state of Kentucky ratified the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery. I'll just tell you right now, and you'll see it again now, it was not 1876, it was 1976.
Absolutely.
That the state of Kentucky actually ratified that.
Absolutely.
Well, Ohio was the same way with what other amendment, it wasn't ratified until the Voting Rights Act.
Right.
You know, those were passed, so there was no need, so it makes the state look bad, although the state has a bad reputation.
Wow, let's not pick on Kentucky in particular.
Yeah.
I think it's part of our long history of not dealing with hard issues, or if we deal with it, we deal with a Band-Aid. You got to deal with the root of this stuff. You just have to. Meaning, educate folks. Educate, educate, educate. Not, when are we going to get over it? I mean, I can have that debate,
I think,
but I debate. That's what I do.
I was going to just say, and let's see, if we all figure out how integral we are to develop this country from slave growing up to the inventions people have made, I think that's the only way that we'll begin to respect each other. And I understand these things have happened, they can stop happening, but if I appreciate one person for the invention and make my life a lot easier, and another for this invention,
Sure.
we can grow beyond where we're at now. I mean,
Absolutely.
and just, this is just, I think it's as you said, education, our system has to
Sure.
give a good education to everybody.
But here's the other piece, which I kind of juggle things. Because on the one hand, I want to recognize the struggle still continues, but on the other hand, let's recognize the progress. Because as I tell my students, in the United States, 70 years ago, I'm not standing in front of you for obvious reasons. So don't tell me progress hasn't been made. Don't tell me things haven't changed, because I'm not in front of you. But at the same time, you still got to deal with the contradictions and the struggle, the perseverance, whoever you are. Because we're just talking about Underground Railroad. I can have the same conversation about gender issues and class issues and all this other stuff. So you gotta recognize the positives and maintain the struggle. Because if you forget about both interconnecting, it's going to be a problem.
Not the bathroom.
I was looking for my little hook like the Dawn Show. Yes, ma'am.
Well, just going off of what you said, and actually also the question about whether Beloved was a true story or not, both which seem like really great questions. There's to me, there are two authors that are telling really significant stories about that. Not only Toni Morrison, but also Harriet Beecher Stowe, who is, you know, at the time of 1841 riots, her brother had a printing press that was thrown into the Ohio River because he was an abolitionist. And this is when, speaking of being educated, Harriet Beecher Stowe, she came from this big family of intellectuals that all thought on their own and not very well off, which I think most people don't realize. They were always poor, but incidentally, she was a fence sitter until then, and then she decided at that point when she was really seeing what was happening that she was going to become an abolitionist herself, and that sort of started her journey in. You know, when she's telling the story that she does the same thing that Morrison does, where she's lacing things that are true with the things that aren't, like Eliza's escape across the Ohio River and all that. But then but Toni Morrison, the fact that she's so fascinated with this story, when Toni Morrison, who's in some ways I would consider the premier American writer, who's, you know, she's, and she has said herself in lectures that her mission is to tell the story that needed to be told. And she had to use it partly facts and partly imagination. And she puts together different stories into that Margaret Garner story that she's so fascinated with. She knows from several accounts. One of the things that's so fascinating to me about that story that she does in the book, it doesn't come across in the movie, is when Setha, Margaret, has to watch her husband being abused. And what that does to her mind is, and that's something she tells in the book. And then I guess, you know, the horror, the multiple incidents of infanticide. The Margaret Garner wasn't in a vacuum, of course, in trying to kill her children. So the fact, the actual story of Beloved, to me, tells the story of the pain that you would have to be in to be so desperate not to return to slavery that you'd want to kill your children. So,
I mean, and I'm going to take one more question. Because there's no enslavement without violence. And violence is part of the system. I mean, and it's defined differently for different people. It's different defining if you're an adult, if you're older, if you're a woman, if you're a man, if you're a child. But you can't have a system of total control, which is the plantation and slave owners wanted, without an aspect of violence. It's just what it is. And how you deal with that violence is the key. Because again, in her mind, her perseverance is not letting her child grow up under that system. We may not all agree with that as a good option, but we're all not Margaret Garner. We're just not. But in her mind, her options are very limited, and that's an option in her mind. So I'm going to take one more question, because I'm sorry. I'm getting bombarded by things. One more question. Anybody?
You still got 3 minutes.
Let's type in one more question. Is there 1 minute?
Go ahead, I'll read it.
Yes, sir.
There was another riot right before the Civil War, 1858.
Yep.
What was the outcome on that? Did you also have a mass exodus of black citizens in the country?
That's not in this one. Yeah, it's just not in this one. Yeah, it's a two-part response. Number one, a number of African Americans decide to leave that particular area, but a number of African Americans decide to fortify their community instead. And so you have this division going on. Those folks who decide to keep going and moving north all the way up to Canada. And then there's other folks who decide, we're not moving. We're going to fortify our community because it's our community. We're not going anywhere. We don't care what they do. And so that's the response of the African Americans based on that. Right? I'm sorry, we could talk for 2 more hours.